I'm your host, Milica Hennick, back with you today, talking about academic podcast entanglements. Today, I'm here with Kim Fox. Kim is a professor at the American University in Cairo, AUC, in Egypt. In addition to teaching students podcasting, she conducts academic research on podcasts and produces an award-winning podcast titled, correct me if I'm wrong, Ekimeser? Yeah.
Yes, you almost had it. A little more, if you just would have went with it. Ekiyamasa.
Ekimeser.
Been teaching for a long time. I think I've been teaching now longer than I worked in the field. So I used to work in radio, commercial, public radio in the US. But now I've been teaching. I think I've been in AUC since 2009, but I also taught for some years before leaving the US. So I've been teaching college for quite some time now. In Cairo, I mostly teach audio courses. I taught an audio production course for a long time. It used to be called radio production. And then I developed and designed a introduction to podcasting course. I think that was in the fall of 2018, maybe. And so, yeah, those are our two primary audio courses, but we also have audio throughout the curriculum. And I do a lot of service work, media education, leadership, that kind of thing. And I have the podcast, the Ekia Master podcast as well.
Fantastic. Busy lady.
It's a lot.
So why podcasting? What got you interested with podcasting? I always get this question asked, and I ask you, why?
Yeah, for me, it's an extension of my love for audio and radio, which I grew up listening to radio in my hometown of Akron, Ohio. It was just a really big part of our community. I went on to work in radio in my hometown, and then in college, working at a public radio station while I was in college for 4 years. And then I started working in commercial radio, and it's just gone on from there. So when the opportunity came for podcasting and it entered the scene, it's not even a transition because I still dabble in both. Like, this is my space, it's the audio space. So when you say, like, why podcasting, I'm like, why not? It's the thing that I like. I like audio stories. I like narrative nonfiction stories. So whether that's in a podcast or live on the radio or terrestrial radio, I'm interested. So yeah.
So my research involves investigating podcasts as a medium in higher education, specifically connecting knowledge mobilization with academic environments. So my previous research in 2021 to 2022 was looking at podcasts, and I felt our university at McMaster, the space was just beginning to experiment with podcasts. We were incorporating them within our coursework as assignments, and maybe we'd have some thrown in there in additional lecture materials. So in reflection to my previous podcast, the SLPE, most of the professors were interested, but they were still hesitant. Apart from the Art of Change, which was a course based on listening to a podcast prior to lecture, I felt like they were still hesitant using podcast itself. They were recording some audio files, but podcasting, not really. And this was across from humanities and social sciences faculty. So I believe you've engaged with podcasting audio studies, which you've just mentioned. So can you tell us about your approaches to teaching audio and podcasting to students? From your standpoint, what do you think the hesitancies are in applying podcasts to teaching and learning?
Yeah, I'm going to table that one quick moment because I do have another question for you. What's your definition of knowledge mobilization?
So knowledge mobilization, I look at the whole translation of information, the synthesis of information, the co-production, co-creation, and the dissemination. I'm looking at all the phases. I feel like podcasting is always at the end. They always look at it as a dissemination piece, and we're just going to use it to amplify our research or amplify our teaching at the end. But I'm looking at it as being meshed within.
And that's interesting because when we're talking about, for example, news, like, no, we're talking about a reporter has to go out and develop that entire thing. So it is not just sort of regurgitating what's already out there. Not always, but some of it is what we call enterprise reporting, where they're getting that information firsthand to share with the community. So my approach for teaching audio, at least what I've found to be most successful for me, is it's three-pronged. I think there's another prong, but I won't go into it. One of the prongs is project-based learning. So your project-based learning is going to be that scaffolding. Most of my students are coming to me with very little knowledge of audio. Like they don't even listen, for example. And so I want to make sure I'm starting at the beginning. Like one of my intro to podcasting course, their first assignment is to do an essay. It's called the This I Believe essay. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's been out there. It's online. It's very popular. And I'm like, I just need you to have a belief and be able to write it down and then deliver it. And we start there because it's just like, let's not overwhelm them with, hey, what kind of equipment, what kind of mic, all these other things. So let's just get them started with, your ability to tell a story, basically. So that's the project-based learning in terms of the scaffolding. And once I get them there, we sort of gradually go throughout the semester to build on those skills, build on their ability to speak and how they speak, and then obviously do some editing and things like that. And it also gives them confidence. So that project-based learning, it's called PBL in case you want to look it up. Another approach is authentic and active learning, which overlaps with the third part, which is feminist pedagogy. And both of those are giving students agency. So most of my students know this by now. I'm just not going to tell them what to do. I'm like, I need you to come to the table with ideas and we can workshop your idea. I need you, and then I need the students to be able to learn how to critique, as opposed to just telling someone who did a really bad piece, like, yeah, I didn't like it. Like we have to, like, how do we critique each other's work that gives people the confidence to go out and want to improve on their work? So that's that active and engaged community. It's also a part of saying what we do in the classroom mirrors what is happening in real life. Like we're not just doing this mock thing in the classroom. And we're also posting our finished work in the public sphere, because in journalism, that's where your work will live anyway. So those are kind of my three pillars.
Yeah, use knowledge mobilization in every aspect of your course development.
Right, and that's why I like this term that you're using, though, in terms of this knowledge mobilization, the co-production. Like, yes, sometimes in audio, you feel like you're working solo, but you kind of need some other people to come in and help you navigate that space. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I love the co-production part of it. But yeah, I don't want to take you off task.
For my master's creative project, I've been focusing on a podcast thread of methodology. You've been using the authentic active learning, which is a feminist methodology. I came across a critical podcasting methodology by Brandon Edwards Sooth. I was just investigating. I'm like, has someone created or developed a podcast method that we could use? And I stumbled upon his, which was interesting because it touches upon a lot about critical reflexivity, voices, counter narratives, the dialogical spiral, and public pedagogy journalism. Where I have a question for you in terms of the journalism aspects of things. Challenging the research participant binary. So where speakers, listeners share understandings, they learn and they're open to vulnerability. In this sense, in what ways can you see critical podcasting methodology being employed into practice?
I think it's really easy to bring it into practice. I mean, it's essentially there and we're not calling it this. So this, for example, critical reflexivity, this shows up in feminist pedagogy because after every assignment, students, at least for me, students have to do a reflection. Like, and we do an end of semester reflection. So it's just like, let's bring it all together. And the end of semester reflection is kind of fun because for me, I'm like, do this in 2 to 3 minutes. And they usually go 5 minutes because they really get into it. I'm like, so I have them do an audio voice note for their end of semester reflection.
Excellent.
So that's a lot of fun for me.
Yeah.
So that reflection is already embedded, or it should be. And it's helpful to do a reflection after each assignment because it's going to help you determine, like, it's going to help the student that learning resonates in that phase of reflexivity. And it's going to also help me as the educator know, like, okay, what went right or didn't go right about this project. Even if you've been doing it several semesters, times change. We're dealing with this sort of post-COVID crew now, and they're a different kind of bunch. So like sometimes we have to adjust our pedagogy based on changing times. So that part is already there. I think the voice part is sort of there as well, at least for me. If you're working, like you say, in investigative or narrative nonfiction, typically they are looking at more than one perspective in a piece, or talking to more than one person. Like I tell the students, like, hey, I don't want a piece that's full of experts and talking heads. Like we need to diversify this and get, other perspectives in the piece. So that's kind of already there. And the same thing about the counter narratives. I don't understand the difference between the voices and the counter narratives, but I actually do. I can see the difference. And this public pedagogy, again, that should be for me, because I'm in journalism. Maybe that's why it's like, yeah, we're going to put our work into the public sphere because that's where it belongs. That's where the dialogue is going to happen that builds on whatever you've put out into the public sphere. So I'm certainly a fan of, like you say, this, where are we learning what we learn? And it doesn't always have to be in this text-based capacity. And I think we're learning that from this generation, and because they aren't really attracted to text-based knowledge. They just aren't. And what are we doing about it? People are going to video and they're kind of forgetting about audio. Like that is something that is also, like you already know this, that's another vehicle for knowledge sharing.
Yeah, for sure. What are some of the potentials or disconnects that could perhaps complicate things with adding a critical podcasting methodology that's across disciplines? Do you see any dangers? Do you think?
No, it's about time and the time to design the course so that it fits it in. Mm-hmm. So for example, when I'm doing an assignment, there are usually 3 components. There's going to be a draft script. After the draft script, we're going to do in class, we do what I call an open critique. I'll pull up their draft script and I'm like, read it to us. Tell us what, and then we'll have a discussion. Here's what's working, here's what's not working. And we'll kind of workshop the script like right in front of everyone. So that's phase 1. The second phase is a rough cut. So then you're going to take the audio and then you're going to assemble it, like, okay, I've got the audio, I've got, this is what I'm going to do. Same thing. We come out of that, we do another critique. Here's what I'm doing here. And then they have a final submission. That scaffolding of the assignment is really also, you have to build that into the syllabus. Otherwise, you're going to say, I'm going to do this assignment in a week. That's not enough time if you want good quality end result. So scaffolding each of those sections is also key. But again, when you're designing your course, you need to be able to say, how many times can I do that? How much time do I need? Do I need a week? Do I need 2 weeks? What other things are the students doing? So this is also, I don't think there's a problem with the process. You just need to design it so that it works for you, because you're the one who's also doing the critiques. So you need time for yourself. And sometimes a week isn't it if you have like 30 students. You need more time. And so normally I try to get them to have their drafts, come to class. I'll do 1 or 2 as an open, and then I'll break them up into small groups so they can critique each other's. So there's a peer critique. That's where they're learning to critique each other. And then I try to get my TA to go into their scripts, which we usually use Google Doc. because we can all get in there and I can see what their peers have written. I can see what the TA wrote, and then I can jump in. And even if I have a different opinion than someone else who got into the document, I will say to them like, hey, now you have options. Or if I don't agree with what someone else said, and I think it's just hardcore wrong, I will say, well, in this case, I wouldn't go with what this person said because. So that kind of scaffolding takes time, but is extremely valuable because then the students get used to that process. And then they take that with them to the workforce.
Yeah, I feel that's really important. It's iterative. Like you're constantly going back and forth and you're revamping, revising, and I feel that's the whole process.
And as a part of the critique process, we'll do the critique and then I'll ask the person who's producing it, what do you need from us? What, like they'll say, hey, I'm looking for someone in the interview. I'm looking for a certain kind of music. And so that kind of open dialogue is really helpful.
That would be very helpful. It would be great to have a podcasting course.
True.
So applying this idea into research and podcasting industries, my goal is to shake the medium. How can we understand how medium of knowledge mobilization can be positioned within the methodology of the research process? So this is what I spoke about earlier. So many scholars, research councils, and community-based research places focus on the dissemination. They're just like, how are we going to disseminate this knowledge? So podcasts are seen as like a final deliverable. So what about the rest? So I'm thinking more along the lines as synthesizing primary or secondary research. And how do we go about citing these?
I feel like I'm going to answer part of this because I kind of want to have more of a conversation and not feel like I'm like the one who's espousing all of this information. But what I would like to see is when I'm working with academic research, I don't want to just cite text-based scholarship. So I want to go and find podcasts, but it's almost like if I didn't already listen to that podcast and know it exists and there's something in there that I want to extract, then how do I find that content to then cite in my research? So it's a bit of a problem. I think some of the apps have gotten better at the searchability of this kind of thing, but it's still going to bring you back limited terms. And some people don't put in a description. We don't get enough people putting in the metadata that's going to help us discover something that we can then cite in our academic research. So I'm looking at that as a bit of a challenge. I'll tell you something else that I've seen a little bit, but not a lot. Some of the Serial podcast. I'll give you an example of the podcast. If you look, they have a Wikipedia page that gives you a description of every episode. This is something that's done for TV shows, but it's not often done for podcasts. So I don't know who did it for Serial. It was done for most of I don't think it's done for This American Life in general. And there are a few others, but my point is also that's searchable. And so then that kind of searchability function is what we kind of need with those descriptions and some sort of keywords to help us find these podcasts that could help amplify the content in those podcasts. I mean, I even get my students that I try to walk them through when we're posting, usually we post to SoundCloud. I'm like, yeah, I need you to get, you have the title, we need a good description, we need keywords. I want to know the date of when it was uploaded. I want a Creative Commons license on there. And they just kind of look like, that's so much. And I'm like, but it's so helpful.
Yeah.
Like years later, someone is going to appreciate that you did this.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what students don't know or value is when I try to tell them is like, and also in my classes, we do oral histories. So I teach an oral history methodology. And of course that comes with ethics and, signing a release form, but then we're donating our raw interviews to the university. So that's another set of data and another platform that they have to upload to. But again, this is for future scholars and historians who will value the uncut interview, because in your audio feature, you just took out a couple of sound bites.
Yeah.
So I think that answers part of your question in terms of like, you know, like what's searchable, what can we find? And I have them do transcripts. So that for my students, I'm like, again, the value of a transcript, not everyone can hear. So let's make this thing accessible. Let's try to make it searchable. For me, I've gotten to a point now because I've been doing it so long that I get it, and I have to introduce it to the students in a way that it's not overwhelming. So with the SoundCloud post, I just give them a template. I'm like, here's what you need to plug in.
Oh, that's great.
So I just need you to go check it off because it needs to be just like this. It makes it easier. It's still a lot of, like what to put where, but again, the value of it for us who deal with metadata and are looking for that searchability is important.
So if I was to, synthesize podcasts as my secondary data, it is difficult to find. Especially I find scholars that are doing the research via podcasting, they choose certain platforms. And how do you know which platform they're using? Am I subscribed to this platform? Is it on a website that is hidden somewhere in the matrix? I don't know. So it's very challenging. So as a student, I was like, oh, I'm just going to choose Spotify. I'm just going to choose YouTube. Because I didn't know what was available to me at that time. Now I'm like, oh, maybe I should have a website. Maybe I should do something on the side. But then again, it leads to being hidden. And what we're trying to do is amplify. We're not trying to hide.
I have a really funny story about this from when I first started teaching in Cairo. And I showed up on campus and my classroom was in a classroom with a whiteboard. And I'm just like, well, where's the equipment and where's the stuff? And all of a sudden I'm like, oh my God, I gotta reposition and figure this whole thing out. The point is, I have my students upload their audio to the Internet Archive. And it's like genius because I'm just like, we're essentially podcasting because it's got an RSS feed. This is in 2009. And all of that audio is still there.
Amazing.
It's so amazing. I'm just like, what? It's all still there. Because my other point that when you said that was how many times have you discovered something only to find out the audio's not there? Or you can't, you get a 404, the website's dead. And you're like, oh, I thought it was so close.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was my bit of a hack that I kind of fell into.
Yeah. So a lot of colleges and universities, they are starting to develop their own databases.
We have an in-house digital archive, and my student stuff is in both places. Great. So in the assignment, they were at that time, they were doing Internet Archive and they were doing the university's archive. So they were in two places. Now I do SoundCloud and the university archive. And so what happens is invariably students will take it down from SoundCloud, but we have a backup with the university's archive. So usually I'm putting it in at least two places.
Yeah, I tried two places too to see what the audience was like too. But again, I didn't broadcast, I didn't advertise. Maybe for this one I will.
But here's the thing, if you feel like the knowledge is not outdated, then you can just re-push it out.
That's true. Pausing and reflecting on the podcaster's role. So in context of social and cultural realities. As an academic podcaster, what's the social and cultural role changes you've experienced?
I don't think it's happening for me because I'm already in all of these spaces and I'm pretty saturated. I think for some people, I guess, it is kind of two different hats. I was just talking to someone about, the digital self. Mm-hmm. And how I am in real life. So for example, I find that some people might be really shy, but then on their podcast, they come off as very exuberant and, and then you see them in person and they're back to the shy. So just like, we have these different presentations of ourselves in different settings and spaces. I don't know that that's a challenge, but I think it's just something that I've observed. I'm pretty even throughout. Like I am, like in the classroom, it's pretty much who I am as well if you see me out and meet me in person. So I don't think I'm necessarily wearing different hats in terms of personality, but I obviously wear different hats in terms of podcaster, Podfest Cairo organizer, professor, educational leader, those kinds of things.
What are the expectations? Do you feel like they're higher now than they were before in terms of production, podcast production?
For me or just for what I listen to?
I want to say both. Like, what is okay, for yourself personally?
My bar is high for me. So I was just listening to this podcast. You Ain't Seen Nothing. It just won uh, I think it won a Pulitzer or a Peabody. It won one of the big awards. And as I was listening to that, and there was another podcast I listened to several years ago that came out of Chicago. And I'm like, I know what kind of podcast I want to do that's really rich storytelling, in depth, has all these layers of great music, great interviews, archival sound, et cetera, et cetera. And so, yeah, I'm like, I know what I want to do. I just need to be able to do it. And I know the stories that I want to tell using that method. It just takes, but it takes time. So for me, my bar is really high. This is crippling for my students because my bar for them is also high. And it's not only high because of what I listen to and what I can do, but I see what my students can do when I push them. Like I just had a student and she won first place for the Broadcast Education Association in news feature. And then she won top in the SPJ. And then the SPJ, she beat out someone from CUNY's graduate program. So I'm like, she's a junior at my university. Like, but the point is, we're like, look, we're pushing her. Like, you can do this. You can level up a little bit more. And when I play her piece for her, when I play students who have won awards for their audio to other students, they kind of think maybe that could be me. They kind of think like, no, I can't do that. And then it's like, maybe I can do that. Like, give me the confidence. So I think that's really helpful. To say like, again, what is the bar? And the bar is I explain, and that's the thing. I will expose the students to This American Life or this award-winning podcast. Like I played them the trailer for this one that recently won this award, and they were like, "That's really good." And I'm like, "You could do it too." And they're like, "Mm-mm." I'm like, "Mm-hmm." I'm like, "You might not do it in this class this year, but in life, this is doable, right?"
Yeah, anything's doable, right? Yeah.
So yeah, the bar is high. Keep the bar high.
Bar high.
And what I will say to those people who say, well, I don't have any money, I don't have any equipment, I'm like, yeah, these are poor excuses. Like you can still do good things with little resources.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think about academic podcasting in the 21st century as a trend? What are your thoughts? Are they more enticed to listen? Are they less?
There's a community for it, for sure. I know I find that there are certain topics that I'm interested in learning about. Like I've recently been looking at anthropology, ethnography kind of stuff. So I've been searching for podcasts that are addressing those kinds of topics. And I think other people have that same kind of vibe. Of course, there's the podcast studies podcast that exists. It has a lot of room to grow. That's all I can say. Yeah, and I'm involved in the Amplify Podcast Network, which is also tasked with amplifying academic podcasts specifically and trying to cultivate that community. And I'm involved with another organization called the Humanities Podcast Network. So it's nice to be in these different spaces because even though they're different, they have something similar. And I think each one adds to that amplification that you're talking about, that we hope that people aren't just making content and not listening to it. I'm like, because that's the worst. Like, we're all out here making stuff and who's listening? So ideally, we want the listeners to.
So I read that you are involved in Podfest Cairo. You want to let us know a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's my baby. I think someone was asking me like, why did I start Podfest? And I said, well, because it didn't exist here and no one knew what it was, but people would ask me questions and I'm like, let's just bring all the people together. Like, even if it's only 5 of us, like, let's get together and we'll have a thing and we'll see what happens. So Podfest has been going on since 2000. We got our first iteration in the weekend before the country shut down for COVID. So we got really lucky. We were like, oh, we snuck it in. Yay. So I'm already planning the one for next year, which will be a little bit tricky, but it'll be tricky because we normally have it in March. But we also have Ramadan, which is going to complicate things, but we're making some really big plans. And it's just what it is. It's a podcast festival in Cairo, bringing our community together to share knowledge, talk about who's doing what kinds of podcasts, who's having certain kinds of challenges, meet the people. It's always bilingual because we have people who, either don't speak English or don't speak Arabic. And so we have a very vibrant community despite the language barriers. So it's really a lot of fun. And I get support from my university to pull it off.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
what better way to just have everyone come together.
yeah. And just meeting new people and getting to hear their stories and their challenges. Like, hey, why do you podcast? Why are you doing this?
Yeah,
Yeah, it's kind of cool.
for sure. So what are your hopes for the academic podcast community?
I want to see more people get involved and take it seriously. And I say that because listening to a podcast, again, is easy. But who wants to invest in the making of that podcast? Like at my university, the Broadcast Education Association just came out with these school rankings based on how many of your students won an award will determine like where you're going to be on this list. So in audio, we ranked number 11 this year. So someone said to me, well, where were you ranked last year? And, why didn't you rank higher? And I thought, whoa, like that's kind of negative, right? Just hit me in the knee. And then, I came back at them and I said, like, we've ranked 11 with no investment in this program. Like, you've given us nothing. So for me, it's difficult because I don't want to keep going down the road of doing something with nothing.
Yeah.
It's, what I mean? It's just like where's, so, and then it's just like, yeah, like, have you even listened to anything that we've done? Like, we've won enough awards to get us ranked in this international ranking. Have you listened to anything that we've done? Like, we do really good work. The students are proud of their work. And that's the thing. It's just like, and so now for the one that I just told you who won the big award for the SPJ and the BEA, we're doing a listening session on campus for her. Because just like, people need to come and listen. So bring them together and say, this is the wow. And the other thing, and I had another colleague who said, like, why are you submitting your student stuff for awards? It was like, yeah, it's just like I think they tried to say it was a popularity contest. I'm like, it's not a popularity contest. Like I've judged entries, like it's not popularity. I said, but more than anything, it's nice when the student gets validation for their work from someone other than their professor. Mm-hmm. And for me, that I believe in them enough to say, we're gonna submit this because you know why we're gonna submit it? Because it's going to win. Mm-hmm. And this is what I tell them. I'm only submitting it because I think it's going to win. I'm not submitting just to bring up anybody's ego. That's what I want for us. I want more of that. So like my university is very engineering centric. And so it is a chance to say like, hey, we shine over here too. Like we're bringing you international acclaim. Mm-hmm. That kind of respect is what I want for us.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's with us too. We have more science. They all get the funding, they all get everything. And then there's humanities here in the corner.
Right. Like over here in the corner, like, look, we can bring you some respect too, people.
Yeah.
And I think that for me, that is the beauty of academic podcasts, because I mean, I haven't dangled this in front of my university yet, but it's to say, you do realize that what we do is transferable to anything. So a bank can benefit from having a podcast. Like all of these industries can benefit from this knowledge, this transfer of knowledge and knowledge sharing. If we had a podcast about the university, guess what? We could talk about the awards that we're winning, and we can do our own publicity. We could talk about everything that we're doing on campus. So yeah, just trying to deal with that bit of a battle is sometimes a bit challenging, for sure.
Yeah, but I like how you incorporate, it's kind of like a book talk or a book launch. You have like a listen. What did you call
Yes,
it?
a listening session.
Listening session. Yeah, we should have that.
Oh, you should.
Oh, that's great. So I have final thoughts.
Yes. What do you want to share?
What are your biggest takeaways you hope listeners to learn?
I love listening to interview podcasts, and that kind of knowledge sharing just really resonates with me. The power of storytelling, people who tell really good stories, people who have interesting stories to tell. All of that really stands out. And so I want people to get out there and do that kind of work, to know that there's value in every kind of story that can be told. And I remember years ago, I had one student and she couldn't find a story for her audio feature. And I don't know why. She said she just went downtown and started walking around, and she doesn't live in downtown, so she's really out of her neighborhood. But she found this woman who was a street vendor, and she just was like, there's a woman street vendor, like, the whole gender dynamics of, a woman in the street who's cooking and da da da. Anyway, it ended up being such an amazing story because the woman was so interested in being a part and telling her story, and that empowerment that came from all of these levels. And it was like, wow. And then it's just like what we did, because that story ended up winning some awards. It gets more recognition. The woman ended up being on this local TV show. It was just like the growth of that. And that's what the power of storytelling is, because this woman's English was not good. And she was like, my English is good enough for me to tell my own story.
Yeah,
And right.
for sure. Yeah.
So I love that everyone's story is so valuable.
We learn from one another too. Like you bounce off of one another, and yeah, voices are important.
Yes. So I think that's a very, very strong takeaway. Like, and talk to your family. I love documenting family history because it's kind of undocumented, things that happen and we know, and it's kind of a family tradition, but it's not a documented conversation.
Yes, you're right. There's so much of that. At least in my culture, there is so much of that. Like,
but it's so fun, and you have their voice forever.
you're right. Oh, that's a new podcast. That would be fantastic to do. The Hinnick family.
Right. Exactly. That's going to be a good one.
Add all the generations in there. All right. And my signature question, what are your favorite podcasts you listen to?
Well, I'll go back and tell you the one that I said I was listening to just now. Like I've been listening to it all day. It's called You Didn't See Nothing. My other favorites, some of them have gone away. And one of them was, it won a Peabody. You Didn't See Nothing. Really good, great narrative storytelling, great sound design. It's just great narration, great everything. I'm listening to The Take. The Take is from Al Jazeera. It's a lot of newsy, a little bit of in-depth, which I really like. What else is on my list? I listened to The Seven from the Washington Post. Again, it's newsy. It's going to keep me up to date on what's going on out there. I don't know if I mentioned Fanti. I used to love that one. They've stopped doing it, and I'm kind of sad about it, and I really miss it. Oh, but the one that I do listen to every week is Vibe Check. So what I didn't say about Vibe Check in my class is that Vibe Check is, they have 3 hosts, and they talk about current events, and they, from their own lens, but it's really informative and interesting. But they always start the podcast off with a vibe check. How are you doing? What's your vibe? So I brought that into my classroom. and the students absolutely love it.
Mhm.
One day in one of my classes, I started class without the vibe check. And the young lady put up her hand. She was just like, "You forgot to do the vibe check." And I was like, "Oh, well, like, let's do the vibe check." And she was like, "Yeah, let's." And I'm like, and so they'll go around and like, it's the end of the semester right now. And so yesterday we did a vibe check in class and they were just like, "We are struggling." And so they were then giving advice to each other for how to manage these last days of the semester when it's really hectic.
Yeah.
And it's just like, and the beauty of that is like, you're not the only one struggling. Like, so, it's tough for you. Yes. And so we kind of said to one young lady, it's just like, look, you're a perfectionist and it's not going to work in your favor. You're going to have to bring it down and do what you can do and finish it up.
Yeah.
So that kind of, I love the vibe check because I get to check in on them to be like, how are you doing? What's going on? What's good? What's not so good?
Yeah. And it builds that relation.
It builds the community. It gives us a connection. Yes, it's a lot of things, and it just works well with the other things that I talked about that we do in the class.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Thank you so much. I would like to
Yeah.
thank you for taking the time out of your day to discuss podcasting with us.
No, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
I appreciate Kim sharing her academic podcast pedagogy with us. She demonstrated the importance of classroom design, dialogue, and building community. We learned that podcasting as public pedagogy relates to enterprise reporting and radio broadcasting, which shares and extends knowledge to broader audiences. I quote Kim, "It's where it belongs, in the public sphere," end quote. But she gives us advice to be attentive to our environments and adjust to our practice of academic podcasting according to the times. This comment speaks to Brandon's CPM, focusing on the contextual, local, and situational. Overall, Kim encourages students to co-create and co-produce podcasts from a feminist pedagogical lens, which has critical reflexivity embedded within. This gives students agency to workshop their own ideas, critique each other's work, and be an active member in their community. She reminds us to set the bar high, level up. That's all for our episode today. Our next episode involves sonic engagements with PhD candidate Roxana Escobar. Ciao for now.